Hey, this is Erica from Ever Educating, and this channel is teaching tips, tools, ideas, and resources for new college instructors. The theme of the month is assessment, and we have this final video, which is about ungraded assignments, which might sound strange in connection to assessments, but it'll make more sense in a minute here. But let's go ahead and dive into a few ideas of ungraded assignments that will help students succeed in your classroom. Ungraded activities can be a really great way to assess if students have specific knowledge or skills that they need for your course. So for example, this is not a major assignment, but instead it's an ungraded activity where you're asking, where you're testing, have students entered your classroom with a piece of foundational knowledge or a foundational skill. So have they figured out, do they know how to do X, Y, and Z? Because your expectation is that they already know how to do this coming into your course. But if you find out that they don't know how to do this, then you can tweak your lessons accordingly. So for example, let's say I'm in a literature course and it's sophomore year, you have assumptions about certain terms that they know, certain skills that they have, but you want to make sure that that's actually accurate. So you might create a quiz that's ungraded where you have, hey, here are all these terms. Can you tell me, or can you pick, if it's multiple choice, the definitions of these various literary terms? Or you might have scenarios. So here's an activity where I give an example from a novel or from a poem or from a fairy tale, etc. Can you tell me what this scenario, what this excerpt is an example of? Can you recognize a metaphor when you see one? Can you recognize an example of figurative language? Okay. So, or you might have a skill sample activity. You're a sophomore. I assume that at this point you can write an argumentative thesis statement. That I'm gonna test that, right? I'm gonna give a small activity where, hey, here's this poem. Write an argumentative thesis statement about this poem, right? Pretend you're gonna write a paper, but all I need is a thesis statement, and then you submit that, and then I can read all these students' responses and say, okay, yeah, of my 30 students, 20 of them understand this. 5 of them wrote an exploratory thesis statement, and the other 5 just described the poem. They didn't make an argument whatsoever or create thesis whatsoever. Now that I know this, I can plan accordingly. So in this case, you might want to start with a self-assessment survey for your students and see if they can even recognize, if they acknowledge what skills and knowledge they have and which they need to have still. So if you ask them in a survey, how familiar are you with writing an argument thesis statement, right? And they tell you, 1 to 5, and they, you have 4s, you have 3s, you have 5s, etc. And then you have them do that small skill example where you can see, okay, well, Derek said he's a 5 when it comes to writing argument thesis statements. He feels really confident in it. But then when you read his, it was exploratory, right? So now you can have some information on do students actually recognize their own knowledge, their own skills, or do we want to make sure that we're explaining things and meeting with them and making everybody on the same page by doing this kind of ungraded activity? Another example of ungraded activities are essential checks. So this could be really helpful if students don't seem to be really paying attention to the directions, to the instructions in your course. They're asking you questions and the answers are evident in the syllabus. So you might have these ungraded quizzes. Now, a few options here. It might just be a quiz that you give them, right? So you might have, hey, it's week 1. We went over the syllabus. Take some time to read it as well. And at the end of the week, I'm going to give you a syllabus quiz because I want to make sure you're actually paying attention to what I say in the syllabus. And you test them on certain policies, certain information about important dates, etc. And so you can actually give students a reason to take the time to read through the syllabus. Now, since it's ungraded, you might want to give some stakes here. So it might be that you make it a prerequisite. If it's an online course, you're not going to be able to open the week 2 module until you take this quiz and pass it with 90%. Okay? Or if it's an in-person class, you still might say, hey, I expect you to turn this in because on week 2, we're going to have this other assignment and you might do that assignment, but I'm not going to grade it until you do this quiz because it's required that you do the syllabus quiz before I will accept your assignment for week 2. So you can make it, depending if it's an in-person class or if it's an online course, you can make it a requirement for something that comes later. Or you can do a more positive spin. Hey, complete this essentials check and you get an extra credit point on the next assignment. Or you might have, if it's a check that's being done tied to an assignment, right? So maybe unit 1, you had them go over the assignment instructions, you see if they have any questions, yada yada. And then you say, okay, for homework, I want you to do this quick quiz. That is a check to make sure that you're actually understanding, that you're actually paying attention to key elements of the assignment instructions. And if you complete it, you'll get 1 extra credit point on the assignment itself. So again, you can have it done in different ways depending on how much you want to require students to complete this check. But it can be a good way to get a sense of, okay, I have these assignment instructions, I had them do this quiz, and yet there are multiple students who misunderstood my statement here. Let me make sure I clarify this next class period so that everybody does, the correct thing when it comes to this assignment. Another option is knowledge checks. So in this case, it's not knowledge that they are coming into the class with, but you might be a few weeks into the semester and they should have understanding. They should be able to identify specific concepts. They should be able to articulate them. They should be able to use them in certain ways. So you might have, again, some kind of quiz where you're checking to see if they do this, some kind of scenario-based activity where they have to actually implement and recognize certain course concepts. Or you might have lesson interactive. So potentially in your LMS, your learning management system, you might have ways to add interactives to certain pages on there. So you might have, hey, answer this question, this short answer one, or this fill in the blank, or this multiple choice. And in that case, they can go ahead and check their knowledge before they move on to the next lesson or to the next week. Now, the format on these really depends on whether student or faculty assessment is needed. So if you want to give them more ownership over this, and it's not that you need to see their answers, but you just want them to be able to take the time to answer these questions, then potentially this might be an interactive where they're not turning it in to you as faculty. It's like, hey, here's this activity that you can complete on your own time. And when you submit it, you'll see automatically the correct answers. But it's nothing that I'm giving you feedback on. It's not something that I'm looking at. It's just for your own sake to make sure that you understand these certain things before we move on to the next weeks. So you can potentially do it that way. Or if you do want to make sure that they're on the right track, you might design it in a way that you do see it yourself. And so there is that faculty assessment aspect where like, hey, you're turning this in, I'm going to actually review the answers on my own. And then I'll get back to you with, feedback on the activity. So it can be done, multiple ways. Similar to the skills check, it can be done in those 2 ways as well. Though in this case, it's probably best to have the faculty aspect of it because, you want to make sure that they are doing these practical skills in a way that will help them, into the future of your course or for specific assignments. So in this case, again, you're checking, hey, can students correctly demonstrate a core skill? Can they do an analysis? Can they write a thesis statement? Can they, solve this kind of math problem? Can they find a resource in the library that's actually, legitimate and recently published and ties into the course concept of the week, right? So again, the activity might be a scenario activity, like, hey, imagine this is the case. Now go ahead and do this thing, right? So demonstrate the skill tied to the course based off of this scenario. It could be a tool test. So again, if you're doing a lesson on research, you might have, hey, I want you to go to library databases and find 3 articles, one from an academic journal, one from, an edited collection, and one from the web. And they all have to be published in the last 5 years by legitimate sources, okay? And so you're testing their knowledge of using a specific tool. Or again, if you're doing some kind of math or computer science, maybe there's a certain third-party tool that you need to be using so that you can test your knowledge on this as well. And again, a lesson interactive, so it might just be, hey, you had this lesson, go ahead and then complete this activity where you're applying a certain skill that you learned in this lesson if you're teaching an online course. Now, the format depends, again, on whether student or faculty assessment is needed, but also consider that this type of ungraded activity likely requires the most detailed instructions and feedback if you are giving faculty feedback. Because in this case, since you're asking them to practice a skill, you want to give them, hey, here's some, in-depth details on what I'm asking you to do with this specific skill or the specific tool. Go ahead and do that and then submit it. and then you give them feedback on how they did. So again, if you're testing their ability to use a certain tool that is important to your field, then it probably will take you some time to describe what you need to be doing and also explain like, hey, you did X, Y, and Z right, but then A, B, and C was not done correctly. So it's just need to consider that it is probably the most time consuming of these types of ungraded activities. And then finally, you might have exit cards. So you've probably heard of these. I have a video about this already. But in this case, it's an ungraded activity. We're seeing how students are feeling about what they are learning and how they're learning. So you might have, if you're in person, just pass out some index cards and have students answer a quick question. How are you feeling about the, lesson that I gave today? Is there anything that you're unclear about? Let me know in the card so I can clarify that either with the time I have left during this class period or during the next class period. You might have a pear deck if you're doing something more digital, where again, pear decks can be different types of questions. It could be short answer, it could be multiple choice. There are different formats. I have a video about this as well that I'll link. Or you might just have a Likert scale. Hey, 1 to 5, how are you feeling about A? How are you feeling about B? What do you think would be best next week when it comes to how I teach this activity? Do you want it as a video? Do you want it as a podcast episode? Do you want it to be an in-person activity that we do? Tell me where you're at with what you prefer, for the next activity. It's going to be student choice, majority rules, right? So this is probably the quickest activity to create and complete because it's literally just like a quick question, getting a feelings check from your students. And it's not so much like, hey, practice a skill or apply this knowledge. It's just, how are you feeling? What are you thinking? What's your idea for what's coming up? So as far as how this type of activity can be used, it's probably the one that can be used the most often because it's so fast. You might want to have daily exit cards. So every single class period, you end it with, hey, quick question. What's your biggest takeaway? What are you most confused by from what we covered today? Maybe it's weekly. Hey, the week is over. Give me a sense of how it went in your opinion. Or it could be a unit basis. All right, we have this major unit that's covered over 5 weeks. At the end of those 5 weeks, hey, what are your thoughts? What did you learn? What do you want to know more about? What are you so confused by? What are you struggling with? So that can be an approach as well. Again, since these are ungraded, you really want to consider the amount of time and effort needed to complete them. Some students will struggle with completing ungraded activities because they don't see it as worth it because it's not going to affect their course grade. So again, you might make it a prerequisite, you might make it extra credit, or it might just be you're teaching in person, hey, we have 5 minutes, this is what you're going to do. There's nowhere for you to go. You're in my class, so go ahead and do this activity. It's not going to be graded, but it's going to let you practice something, and this will help you leading into the next week in X way, or it will help you prepare for the exam, or it will help you make sure that you're doing this assignment correctly, right? You can tell them why it's important, even though it's ungraded, if you're with them in person, teaching in person. So you really want to consider, if it is something that's going to be very time consuming, then maybe it is something you actually offer, an extra credit grade, or maybe it counts towards the participation grade that you might have, like a 5% participation grade. Maybe you're not speaking aloud, but if you do these, they will count towards that. So it's not graded in the sense of it's a 9 out of 10, but it is, hey, if this is helping you with your participation grade by completing them. So there are options here to help them see the worth of completing these activities. If you found this video helpful, click like and let me know, and subscribe to not miss out on future content. We'll have a new theme next month, so you'll find out more in next week's video.